July is World Watercolor Month, founded by Charlie O'Shields from Doodle Wash, and the challenge is to paint something in watercolor every day of the month of July. I love that challenge. I have never participated, but I always wanted to. So, fingers crossed this year. But since it's World Watercolor Month, I think maybe somebody would like some very beginner-friendly tips how to start and approach watercolors. If you have never tried them before, and if you have no idea what they can do, and your only experience with them is in primary school where we all made mud, all of our watercolors were totally dirty and terrible, and I don't remember one nice painting with watercolors from my primary school. But lots have changed since then. I've learned that yes, you can erase in watercolors. It's a bit difficulter, it's not the same as in some other media, it's definitely not as forgiving as acrylics, but you can erase, you will see. Also, you don't have to create mud. I've talked about that in my previous video on how to mix colors, and I used watercolors for those examples. So if you want, check out that video. I think it's here. And in this video we'll learn some other little tips and tricks and some exercises that might help you get along. So you don't have to do a whole painting every day of July. You can just take 10 minutes just to practice some leaves or some strokes or whatever. Watercolor is a wonderful media, and anybody who's been here knows that I'm in love with watercolors. I use them on paper that does not allow watercolors, but I still force it. I love watercolors because they are so magical. They have this wild gentleness. You cannot control them, but they are not in your face, they're not forceful, they're bright and colorful and joyful and playful, but they're also gentle and really nice. As you can see, I'm in love with watercolors. You can create in a lot of different styles with watercolors. You can play with them very loosely and you get this wonderful effect of colors flowing into one another like in no other medium. And if you want, you can also paint totally realistically in watercolors, although I'm definitely not a master of that. They're perfect for urban sketching and nature journaling because they are so portable. And if you want to hear more about that, you can check out my video on what to take in your art bag to your vacations. Let me grab one. This one is the one that is going to vacation with me this year. And it has more or less the same things that I talked about there, so check that video. But for this one, let's focus solely on watercolors. The first things are the materials. You will always hear that it's very good to have good paper. And that certainly holds true. It's much easier to paint with watercolors on better paper. It doesn't warp as much. The heavier it is, the better usually. And of course, cotton paper is a whole class of its own. But for beginners, I would not recommend cotton paper actually, because it can be a bit tricky because the paint can seep in more than you would want. It stays wet longer, which is great if you are experienced in watercolors, but it can be a bit intimidating at first. Besides, it's pretty expensive. So what I would suggest for beginners is this one. This is a nice 300 GSM sturdy watercolor paper, and it works for me really well. But even if you don't have the budget for this kind of paper, although it's not that expensive, I think it's about 10 bucks or something like that. But if you would just like to try to see if this is your thing, you can grab normal cheap copy paper and just play on that and do exercises on that, and then you have beautiful collage paper for your collages, because copy paper is great for collage and watercolors are great for making patterns on copy paper. Of course, you have to be a bit careful when you're gluing that watercolor paper onto collages, because the color can get smeared when you put wet glue on it, but you can remedy that by using less watered down glue or non-water based glue, or just you can be just a little bit careful. I use PVA for everything and it works just fine. Now, next things are watercolors. I don't have professional grade watercolors, I have student grade watercolors, and I love this Schminke set the most. This is student grade Academy set by Schminke, but they are a bit pricier, and other student grade sets work as well. This one is by Winsor & Newton, and this one is from Vincent van Gogh, and you've seen this a lot in my videos already. You might remember, some of you. So you know it works just fine, and it's about $15 or something like that. And Winsor & Newton are even cheaper because it has only 12 colors. Both of them come with a little brush. And all of those sets works just fine. I use them all the time for all of my work, so you don't need professional grade watercolors at all to have fun with watercolors. And even if that is out of your budget, or you're somewhere where you can't buy them, or you would just like to play and make collage papers and you don't want to waste your pretty paints for collage papers, well, then I have these kind of watercolors for you. These are kids watercolors, and believe it or not, I do use them. I use them for painting my collage papers, I use them for painting with kids, and sometimes just to practice something, because every paint is good enough to practice strokes, you know. It doesn't matter how good the paint is if you don't know how to paint a stroke, how to make it nice and smooth. And this works just well for repeating this kind of exercises. Before we do the exercises though, we have to pick up some brushes, right? And again, the same as with paints, you don't need anything fancy. I started with cheap synthetic brushes that are not even made for watercolors, from different brands, Waco, Vernissage, not from an art store even, but it worked pretty well. And they're even better for beginners because they don't hold so much water. Because these great brushes that I really loved, and I waited for more than a year and a half before I invested in them. These are squirrel brushes, and they hold a ton of water and they hold their tip nicely, and I love them. But they are so soft that most beginners don't like them because they are too responsive to every movement, to every little struggle of your hand. So it's sometimes better to start with something like that until you get comfortable with the strokes you make, and then later on you can find, if you like your watercolors, you can invest into something a bit pricier. Another option though are water brushes, and it's a really good option especially for traveling, because you don't have to carry the water with you, of course. And they're also sometimes really nice for painting small areas, because you don't run out of your paint and you don't get those dry lines, and also you can get some really nice gradients from color to no color, if that's your thing. If you want to see some more beginner-friendly watercolor tutorials, you can check out my blog. I got a whole list from other people there, so you can choose between animals, flowers, whatever you like. And if you have any specific wishes which tutorial you would like to see, an animal, a flower, whatever, let me know and I'll make a tutorial myself. Just to show you how you can use your watercolors for different styles. This one is more loose nature illustration, a bit more realistic style. And then you can also use them for fantasy style. You can use them as background for some lettering or some patterns that are waiting to be drawn here. You can also use it in your urban sketching or nature sketching, as you could see in my previous video about nature journaling, because they're so portable. This is another one, very loose style. I love this style from Tony Burt. All these were from Sketchbook Revival classes, by the way. And these are some abstracts, also from Sketchbook Revival. Not exactly my style, but I really liked it. And another one from Rosin, also nature sketching of some beach. And then a totally different style from Terry Ryunan with her cats on heads. She loves to draw cats and paint cats. And another one from Tony Burt. As I said, I love her style, the looseness and everything. This one has just the background in watercolors. And this one is more like a loose nature illustration again, and landscapes and so on. So you can make a lot of different styles in watercolors. However, today we'll just make some collage pattern paper and some collage fodder. This is how I keep my collage fodder, so it's nicely organized. Sometimes it's painted, sometimes it's drawn, sometimes it's stamped. And I keep these little pieces to just put into some of my art pages. I intend to fill this one up. Something I didn't mention before, it's always nice to have at least 2 buckets of water. I sometimes have 3, depending on how large I'm painting. These buckets can be anything from glass jars from your kitchen, jam jars, cucumber jars, or old kitchen pots, or something really fancy. This is a clay cup made by my little daughter, and I really love this one. Or this is a kind of measuring cup or something like that from a laboratory equipment store. It's really cheap but works really well. Then I highly recommend you to have at least 2 little pieces of cotton or something like that, fabric. This was an old breast pad that I got after I stopped breastfeeding, so I couldn't use them, and they're perfect for this. I also have just offcuts from my sewing, and I just hem them around so they don't fray. And I use this to tap the wet paint when needed, and this one I use to just clean my brushes on or remove the excess water. When you start painting with watercolors, always wet the paints first. They also call this activating paints. The easiest way to do that is by spritzing them with this spray bottle, but you could also just drop a little drop of water into each of those paints, and that would still work. Of course, you have to use clean water to do this. If it's really cold outside, it's a good idea to put a warm water that activates them even faster. It's always nice to have a scrap piece of paper nearby so you can test your paints. And as for the paper, you can use normal copy paper for this exercise, or even printer offcuts, something that somebody printed wrongly, or if you have something that you don't need anymore, you can easily print on the other side, or even on this side. It can just add to your design. It will be easier to see if I paint on this side though, so I will do this first. So for our first exercise, we will just draw lines. Now you can see how this paint really activates nicely, and I can try to make nice long lines. And I can try to go slow and see how that affects the line. I can see when the paintbrush runs out of the paint, and I can see how the strokes are different when there's a lot of paint on my paintbrush and when there's a little paint on my paintbrush. And these are all the things that will help me later on when I will paint, and I will see what I need for that particular part of the painting. Because when you combine all these strokes, you can get some really nice results. You can see how the watercolor is much more transparent here than it is here. And you can test it out. You can also test it by going over a wet paint and over dry paint, and you can test it going over, and you see all those different combinations, and then you can choose the one that will fit your painting. And the more you do this, the more you will know how to choose the one that you like for that particular effect that you need. Next, we can try wavy lines. You can try to repeat the same wave. That makes it a bit more challenging. And if you want, you can also try to repeat this from the other side and see which one is more comfortable for you. And pay attention to all those information, because when you'll be painting, you will know when it's best to turn your page. If you're not recording, of course, because if you're recording, then maybe sometimes people won't be able to see anything if you're having your page rotated. But if you're just painting for yourself, this is a great way. Now, I've mentioned that the paint is different depending on how much paint there is on the brush in relation to the water. Now I want to have a lot of paint but just a little bit of water. And you see, you get this special effect, and it's called the dry brushing, where the paint skips these little parts, and this is great for creating texture in organic materials. It's also great for shading part of your painting. As you can see, I can add some quite subtle shading to a part of a painting like this. Now here's a tip about rinsing the brush. If you rinse the brush in this horizontal or vertical number 8 motion, it rinses much better and quicker, and you don't need to press it down to your bottom of your pot. Now we've tried some normal strokes, let's paint some leaves. Since I'm painting leaves, I will try this green. With leaves, you have to press down and then lift up. And you can try how fast you have to lift up to make a nice leaf. It's much easier if the paper is not warped already. So I'll take another one. I'll show you on this one. And if you're not satisfied with it, you can always go over it. Maybe make it a little bit bigger if needed. Press down and lift up. Not all of your paint brushes will make the same marks, so experiment with different brushes. You can also start slow, press down and then lift up quickly, and you get the opposite effect. And if you want, of course, you can start slow, press down and then also pick up slow. And you'll see from which end your paintbrush makes the nicest leaves. Because these cheap brushes are not always the same from all sides. Let me show you the same thing with another brush. When you're activating these paints, you always have to mix them up a bit because they're so chalky. You might say these are not that pretty, and you would be perfectly right. They are not, and you will get better with them with practice, and you will get better with them with better brushes. Both are true, but it's still nice to just practice, and this is quite fine for collage paper because it will be torn and you only need just a little bit of color on it. And you can always make them nicer if you prefer, and if you want to make just some nice leaves. These paint brushes are quite big for such small tips, and they don't hold tip very well, as you can see. But I wanted to show you with those kind of brushes as well, so that you see that you really don't need good paint brushes to start painting. Of course, I encourage you to buy good brushes when you can. It's great, but you don't need to spend a lot of money just to try it out if you like it. And you can still have a lot of fun even when you can't access the fancy materials, like when you're on holidays or something like that. And maybe you find somewhere some kids' watercolors and you would just like to play. Of course, you can even twist the paintbrush. And as you can see, these leaves are much better than those, because this paintbrush is not as beat up as these two were. And now let me try the same thing. My brush, one of my favorites, the one that is from Squirrel. And you can see this is the same hand that makes the same leaves with the same paints. But they look different when I'm holding a different brush. I'm showing you that not to convince you to buy these kind of brushes, because as I said, they can be quite challenging for beginners. But when you get used to one kind of brush, it's always a bit challenging to transition to another kind that has totally different properties. And I wanted to show you that don't be discouraged if your strokes don't look that well. My strokes don't look that well either here. Now I'll speed up so you'll be able to see more patterns. If you just press the paintbrush onto the paper, you get a nice teardrop shape, and if you make rows and rows of the same mark, they can really look stunning. Play around with different shapes that your brush can make. Even the simplest marks can make a beautiful paper. And it doesn't matter that the marks are not all perfect. That is the magic of patterns. They hide mistakes and make everything cohesive. So paint some pretty papers. Even kids' watercolors are okay for that. And you will get to know your brush and what kind of strokes it can make in your hand. If you plan on using your practice paper for collage, paint the design over the edges. That way you can use every last bit. And try to layer design on top of each other. Here I painted the same simple flower shapes in two colors on top of each other. You can use just one color, you can dilute it, or you can use multiple colors. Bonus tip, if you use colors next to each other on the color wheel, it will always look nice. When you make a design with different shapes in various sizes, start with the bigger shapes first and then add the tiny ones in the gaps that are left. This is the easiest way to make a collage paper. Just splatter some paint onto it by tapping the brush loaded with watered down paint. Again, use different shades to make it more interesting. You can also just paint some washes. They make really nice collage papers, especially if you play around with different techniques like dry brushing, and this is also a great way to use up the paint on the palette. Black and white paper is always useful because it's neutral and you can combine it with everything. Besides, I never use black watercolor in painting, and this is a great way to use it up. I just tap the brush onto the paper to get these marks. You can see how different the pattern look when I change the density. Circles are another staple. Big circles, small circles, circles that touch, circles that stand on their own. Notice how dense and regular you like your pattern to be. Try different colors, different brush strokes, different densities and sizes of elements. Make different textures, use different symbols to create patterns, and just have fun. And lastly, I just show you how to paint some different leaves. You can repeat any of those branches a bunch of times on the page and you'll get a nice pattern. But I think we've got enough collage papers for one day. If you want, you can draw on top of those, but that's already for another video. By combining different colors with different designs, the sky is the limit to what you can create. And here I just wanted to show you what you can create from your patterned paper. Here's a page in my art journal, for example, and some collages just for fun. You don't need anything fancy for this, so they're perfect non-pressure art projects. So I hope this gave you some ideas what to do during July. We made a bunch of patterned papers that are great for collage, great for cards, postcards, and so on. And we only needed cheap watercolors, kids grade watercolors, and cheap brushes. Now if you want to see how to turn those papers that we made and those little collage pieces into a postcard like this, let me know and I can make a video about that too. And of course do subscribe to Very Arty Fairy, cause she never lets me alone. She always wants me to do something. And if you like what we do here, subscribe and let me know what you would like to see more of. Till next week, bye bye! July is World Watercolor Wash,